and welcome to Capitol Hill on this post-budget Wednesday. I'm Lyndal Curtis. Rarely has a tax rise produced both tears and applause on the floor of the Parliament. But that happened today as the Prime Minister was brought to tears introducing the rise in the Medicare levy that helps to fund disability care. It's a tax rise the opposition hasn't said a harsh word about today, although it had plenty of harsh judgments about last night's budget. Joining me this evening is Green Senator Rhiannon and Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Lyndal.
Good afternoon.
We'll go first to the Prime Minister in Parliament this morning. Introduced the tax rise, which will go towards paying for the disability insurance scheme.
Over the past 6 years, the idea of a national disability insurance scheme has found a place in our nation's hearts. In March, we gave it a place in our nation's laws. Today, we inscribe it in our nation's finances. The people who have gathered here today from around the country to witness this debate know what this means. There will be no more in principle and no more when circumstances permit. There will be launches, not trials, permanent care, not temporary help. Disability care starts in 7 weeks' time and there will be no turning back. I commend this bill to the House.
This is one budget change that will absolutely be voted on before the Parliament goes to the next election. Josh Frydenberg, the opposition will be supporting this?
Oh, absolutely. The NDIS is a bipartisan policy reform and it couldn't come soon enough for the Australian public. I think there's genuine commitment from both political leaders. What we saw was heartfelt emotion from the Prime Minister. Tony Abbott just spent a week riding his bike around the country raising money for carers. So he's also absolutely committed to the NDIS. So I welcome the reform. I think there are heroes on both sides of the political divide, and I think this is one of the best outcomes from this Parliament.
Lee, this does show what a Parliament can do if policy is pursued over a relatively long time, explained well, advocated well.
Oh, very much so, and it's not just bipartisan, it's all parties were in it. The
multi-partisan.
Greens, yes, very
tripartisan.
Yes, yes, no, we got there, and it's a real credit to people in the community, because it has been a long time coming, and it's fantastic that there was that agreement, and I think it really is a reminder too that there's other vulnerable people who have missed out, like single mothers, people who are looking for a job, people who are struggling on the dole. And it's a reminder that we also need to be coming together to working out those issues.
Josh, what do you think disability care will mean in the long term for those who have a disability and their carers, often their families?
Well, I think it's going to level the playing field. See, if you're in one state and you've got one disability and you're living in another state and you have the same disability, you can actually be funded differently. Or if you have one disability through birth and you have the same disability through a car accident, again, you could be funded differently. And I think people understand that that's not right in the 21st century. So I think that's going to be the greatest change. It's going to level the playing field, and also it's going to provide added resources to the people who need it. But there is still a question how we're going to fund the rest of the NDIS, not just from the levy, but the other $3.5 or nearly $4 billion that's required. And we believe we can bring the budget back into surplus, we can deliver sound economic management, and when we can do that, we can actually provide for more money for the NDIS.
But the government announced other changes last night, other cuts to some spending, increases in some taxes, that it says will go towards funding, fully funding disability care in the long term.
Well, they've actually put a lot of taxes up, and we actually challenge a lot of the assumptions, Lyndal, on which this budget is based, because not only is it producing the 5th biggest deficit in the history of the Commonwealth, the previous 4 coming under the Gillard and Rudd governments, and then next year the 6th biggest, but it's also got these assumptions about where the money's coming from, particularly around the carbon tax and the mining tax, and we think we can challenge those assumptions.
On the way it's chosen to fund disability care, doesn't that do
well,
what you call for?
Yeah, the money's going to have to come from somewhere, and we understand that. But again, you know, the levy and also this money that's being allocated by the government, you know, you need to run budget surpluses if you're going to have the money to provide for this. And we think these are government commitments which are really hollow because they don't have the track record behind them.
But there is a problem for the coalition here, is that because they're not being clear where their money's coming from, they're committed to the scheme, but we need to be raising the money.
And are the Greens prepared to support the sorts of changes the government has outlined to fund this scheme in the long term?
Oh yes, absolutely. We're certainly signed up for that. And the coalition has the problem in terms of, as I've identified, where the money's coming from, but also with regard to Western Australia. You need to get Western Australia on board.
We might move on because we're talking about the bulk of the budget anyway. A question of making choices to fund important programs or an unbelievably overly optimistic look at the bottom line. That was the political choice being presented today.
Now, I don't want to get too political today, of course, but I do want to say a couple of words about the alternative, that is the opposition. And what I want to say today is this. Mr Abbott and Mr Hockey now have the numbers. They're there in black and white, they're there for all to see, and these numbers have been prepared by the same officials who prepared 11 budgets for the former Liberal government. The policy choices in this budget are the policy choices of the Gillard government. The officials give us the numbers, but we choose the policies. That's how government in Australia works. The Treasury does not have one set of numbers for the government and another set of numbers for the alternative government. There's just one set.
Josh, the Treasurer there was making the point that Treasury doesn't produce numbers to order for the government, yet your side of politics has criticised the believability of the numbers. Why do you think Treasury would give the government a set of numbers if it's going to turn round in, I think, 3 months' time and produce an entirely different document during the election campaign?
Well, the point here is that the government's priorities have been wrong. I mean, you know, it keeps talking about this revenue shortfall, $17 billion revenue shortfall, but actually revenue is about 7.5% up year on year. So it doesn't have a revenue problem, Lyndal, it has a spending problem.
But don't you set by, isn't the way budgets work that you look at the amount of money you expect to come in and you base your programs on that?
But I mean, let's take two examples, the mining tax and the carbon tax. I mean, it's heroic assumptions. With the mining tax, I mean, there was so much consultation and produced no revenue. $200 million this year is going to be the peak of it. Now they're saying that by the year they produce a surplus, it will produce $2 billion worth of revenue, 10 times what it is today. That's hard to believe. On the carbon tax, I mean, you've had to see them change their assumptions because of the collapse in the European price. Today, you know, in Europe, it's about $4 or $4.50, and they're predicting by 2015-16 it'll be $12. It doesn't actually make sense. These assumptions should be challenged by the government, and they shouldn't be relying on such optimistic forecasts.
Lee, do you think that the numbers produced by the Treasurer, by the government last night, are overly optimistic?
Well, they do need to tighten up the loopholes in the mining tax if they're going to be able to raise the billions that they're talking about. We've already seen a problem in the mining tax, so there is clearly an issue that needs to change there. But I think that Josh's credibility on this one, when he talks about the economy, is interesting to analyse, because former Prime Minister John Howard is quoted in the papers today as really speaking about what a great shape the economy is in, and he was surprised that the unemployment figures are not so high. So while the coalition might stay on their message and their talking points, Prime Minister Howard is seeing it quite differently.
I do have to ask you this question about the mining tax, and it's one I've asked your colleagues before. This is a tax and a tax design that the Greens in the end supported. You didn't hold the line and say, we're not happy with it and we won't vote for it until we're happy with it.
But that's the nature of Parliament. We totally agree there was problems with that piece of legislation. The mining tax that we're talking about is the watered down form. But at the end of the day, and it's what you do in Parliament all the time, we look at the legislation. If it's basically a bit better than what it was before, you have to support it. We would have liked
But
it
it's
to
not
have
the
been
approach
much
you took
better.
with the CPRS.
Oh no, the CPRS, there was major problems with that. We had advice that it would have resulted in, would have allowed the fossil fuel companies to claim compensation, possibly billions of dollars, if the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions had increased.
Now, we don't know yet what will be legislated in this budget, apart from the Medicare levy before the election. Josh, do you think the decision to scale down the baby bonus, put it into the family payment system, is a sensible one?
Look, we'll have more to say, Lyndal, about the baby bonus. I mean, Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott have been asked this question numerous times over the last, 12 to 15 hours. We're going to look at the budget overall. We know we can't trust the government's forecast. We know we can't trust the government's promises. I mean, they promised 500 times we'd get a budget surplus, and Wayne Swan opened his budget speech last year by saying, today I announce 4 years of surplus. They haven't eventuated. So the truth is we don't know the real state of the books, and we're going to have to be very prudent.
But isn't there always inherent uncertainty about forecasts?
Nothing like this.
You can't say they'll absolutely be set in stone.
Lyndal, nothing like this. I mean, Labor has produced 12 successive budget deficits. We were in government, we produced 10 budget surpluses. We've done it before and we're going to have to do it again. The people of Australia can rely on us to run the economy. When you talk about John Howard, I mean, he created millions of new jobs, 22% increase in real wages, the lowest unemployment and inflation in 3 decades, and he paid back all of the government's debt.
He did.
So
he
you
did
would
sell,
accept what he's now saying?
Hang on, Lee. He did sell Telstra to help him do that. You don't have a large communications company you'll be able to sell off to help you. You'll have to do it. You'll have to do it with cutting back spending much more, won't you?
But Lyndal, if you remember back to 1996, other than defence, which he quarantined spending around 2% of GDP, he cut all those other areas. He built in efficiencies. Some of his changes around the workplace relations areas improved productivity. Unfortunately, in this government, we've been going backwards.
Lee, do you think that more needs to be done to put the budget back on a sustainable footing to allow surpluses in the future to fund the sorts of things that you'd like to see?
Well, we certainly need to change how the budget works, and we always need to aim for a responsible way it's managed. But one of the problems here, and it also relates to what Josh has talked about, yes, the coalition may have had surpluses, but the pain was put on many ordinary people, and that's what we saw with last night's budget. So people on low incomes, your single parents, people who are trying to get a job, like the increases are virtually meaningless in their entitlements, and that's where the government's still not doing the right thing. And so, yes, we need to be aiming for surpluses, but it doesn't have to become an obsession of governments, because then you're failing to raise the money. At times there's nothing wrong with borrowing money. That's where we should be heading with the big infrastructure projects like high-speed rail and other projects. But at the moment, that's what they're failing to do.
And get more private sector involvement in those big infrastructure projects?
Oh, well, some of them, but look, I come from New South Wales, and the problem with public-private partnerships, it all ends up back in taking money out of the public purse when the companies fail, and that's the story of those.
And that's where I'll have to leave it. Lee Rhiannon and Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Josh.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill today. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow. Good night.